Hello, this is Morel Benard with the continuation of the story, David Copperfield. Let's find out what's happening with little Davy. And by the way, please subscribe to the channel Study Coach UK and please share with others. Trying very hard to grow subscribers, increase subscribers. So let me continue with the story of David Copperfield. The last word said was that thus the holidays lagged away until the morning came when Miss Murdstone said, "Here's the last day off," and gave me the closing cup of tea of the vacation. I was not sorry to go. I had lapsed into a stupid state, but I was recovering a little and looking forward to Steerforth, albeit Mr. Creakle loomed behind him. Again, Mr. Barkis appeared at the gate, and again, Miss Murdstone in her warning voice said, "Clara," when my mother bent over to me to bid me farewell. I kissed her and my baby brother, and was very sorry then, but not sorry to go away, for the gulf between us was there, and the parting was there every day. And it is not so much the embrace she gave me that lives in my mind, though it was as fervent as could be, as what followed the embrace. I was in the carrier's cart when I heard her calling to me. I looked out, and she stood at the garden gate alone, holding her baby up in her arms for me to see. It was cold, still weather, and not a hair of her head, nor a fold of her dress was stirred as she looked intently at me, holding up her child. So I lost her. So I saw her afterwards, in my sleep at school, a silent presence near my bed, looking at me with a sane, intent face, holding up her baby in her arms. I pass over all that happened at school until the anniversary of my birthday came round in March, except that Steerforth was more to be admired than ever. I remember nothing. He was going away at the end of the half year, if not sooner, and was more spirited and independent than before in my eyes, and therefore more engaging than before. But beyond this, I remember nothing. The great remembrance by which that time is marked in my mind seems to have swallowed up all lesser recollections and to exist alone. It is even difficult for me to believe that there was a gap of full 2 months between my return to Salem House and the arrival of that birthday. I can only understand that the fact was so, because I know it must have been so. Otherwise I should feel convinced that there was no interval, and that the one occasion trod upon the other's heels. How well I recollect the day, or the kind of day it was. I smell the fog that hung about the place. I see the hoar frost ghostly through it. I feel my rimy hair fall clammy on my cheek. I look along the dim perspective of the schoolroom, with a sputtering candle here and there to light up the foggy morning, and the breath of the boys wreathing and smoking in the raw cold as they blow upon their fingers and tap their feet upon the floor. It was after breakfast, and we had been summoned in from the playground when Mr. Sharp entered and said, "David Copperfield is to go into the parlour." I expected a hamper from Peggoty and brightened at the order. Some of the boys about me put in their claim not to be forgotten in the distribution of the good things as I got out of my seat with great alacrity. "Don't hurry, David," said Mr. Sharp. "There's time enough, my boy. Don't hurry." I might have been surprised by the feeling tone in which he spoke, if I had given it a thought, but I gave it none until afterwards. I hurried away to the parlour, and there I found Mr. Creakle sitting at his breakfast with a cane and a newspaper before him, and Mrs. Creakle with an open letter in her hand, but no hamper. "David Copperfield," said Mrs. Creakle, leading me to a sofa and sitting down beside me. "I want to speak to you particularly. I have something to tell you, my child." Mr. Creakle, at whom of course I looked, shook his head without looking at me, and stopped up a sigh with a very large piece of buttered toast. "You are too young to know how the world changes every day," said Mrs. Creakle, "and how the people in it pass away. But we all have to learn it, David. Some of us when we are young, some of us when we are old, some of us at all times of our lives." I looked at her earnestly. "When you came away from home at the end of the vacation," said Mrs. Creakle after a pause, "were they all well?" After another pause, "Was your mamma well?" I trembled without distinctively knowing why, and still looked at her earnestly, making no attempt to answer. "Because," said she, "I grieve to tell you that I hear this morning your mamma is very ill." A mist rose between Mrs. Creakle and me, and her figure seemed to move in it for an instant. Then I felt the burning tears run down my face, and it was steady again. "She is very dangerously ill," she added. I knew all now. "She is dead?" There was no need to tell me so. I had already broken into a desolate cry and felt an orphan in the wide world. She was very kind to me. She kept me there all day and left me alone sometimes, and I cried and wore myself asleep and awoke and cried again. When I could cry no more, I began to think, and then the oppression on my breast was heaviest, and my grief a dull pain that there was no ease for. And yet my thoughts were idle, not intent on the calamity that weighed upon my heart, but idly loitering near it. I thought of our house shut up and hushed. I thought of the little baby who, Mrs. Creakle said, had been pining away for some time, and who they believe would die too. I thought of my father's grave in the churchyard by our house, and of my mother lying there beneath the tree I knew so well. I stood upon a chair when I was left alone, and looked into the glass to see how red my eyes were, and how sorrowful my face. I considered after some hours were gone, if my tears were really hard to flow now, as they seemed to be what, in connection with my loss, it would affect me most to think of when I drew near home, for I was going home to the funeral. I am sensible of having felt that a dignity attached to me among the rest of the boys, and that I was important in my affliction. If every child was stricken with sincere grief, I was. But I remember that this importance was a kind of satisfaction to me, when I walked in the playground that afternoon while the boys were in school. When I saw them glancing at me out of the windows as they went up to their classes. I felt distinguished and looked more melancholy and walked slower. When school was over and they came out and spoke to me, I felt it rather good in myself not to be proud to any of them and to take exactly the same notice of them all as well before. I was to go home next night, not by the mail, but by the heavy night coach which was called the Farmer, and was principally used by country people travelling short, intermediate distances upon the road. We had no storytelling that evening, and Traddles insisted on lending me his pillow. I don't know what good he thought it would do me, for I had one of my own. That was all he had to lend, poor fellow, except a sheet of letter paper full of skeletons, and that he gave me at parting, as a soother of my sorrows and a contribution to my peace of mind. I left Salem House upon the morrow afternoon. I little thought then that I left it never to return. We travelled very slowly all night, and did not get into Yarmouth before 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. I looked out for Mr. Barkis, but he was not there, and instead of him a fat, short-winded mercenary boy-looking old man in black, with rusty little bunches of ribbons at the knees of his breeches, black stockings and a broad-brimmed hat, came puffing up to the coach window and said, "Master Copperfield?" "Yes, sir." "Will you come with me, young sir, if you please?" he said, opening the door, "and I shall have the pleasure of taking you home." I put my hand in his, wondering who he was, and he walked away to a shop in a narrow street on which was written, "Omer, draper, tailor, haberdasher, funeral furnisher, etc." It was a close and stifling little shop, full of all sorts of clothing, made and unmade, including one window full of beaver hats and bonnets. We went into a little back parlour behind the shop, where we found 3 young women at work on a quantity of black materials, which were heaped upon the table, and little bits and cuttings of which were littered all over the floor. There was a good fire in the room, and the breathless smell of warm black crepe. I did not know what the smell was then, but I know now. The 3 young women, who appeared to be very industrious and comfortable, raised their heads to look at me and then went on with their work. Stitch, stitch, stitch. At the same time, there came from a workshop across the little yard outside the window a regular sound of hammering that kept a kind of tune, rat-tat-tat, 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 without any variation. "Well," said my conductor to one of the 3 young women, "how do you get on, Minnie?" "We shall be ready by the train on time," she replied gaily, without looking up. "Don't you be afraid, father." Mr. Omer took off his broad-brimmed hat and sat down and panted. He was so fat that he was obliged to pant sometimes before he could say, "That's right." "Father," said Minnie playfully, "what a purpose you do grow." "Well, I don't know how it is, my dear," he replied, considering about it. "I'm rather so." "You are such a comfortable man, you see," said Minnie. "You take things so easy." No use taking them otherwise, my dear, said Mr. Omer. No, indeed, returned his daughter. We are all pretty gay here, thank heavens, ain't we, father? I hope so, my dear, said Mr. Omer. As I have got my breath now, I think I'll measure this young scholar. Would you walk into the shop, Master Copperfield? I preceded Mr. Omer, in compliance with his request, and after showing me a roll of cloth which he said was extra super and too good mourning for anything short of parents, he took my various dimensions and put them down in a book. While he was recording them, he called my attention to his stock in trade and to certain fashions which he said had just come up, and to certain other fashions which he said had just gone out. And by that sort of thing we were very often loose a little mint of money, said Mr. Omer. But fashions are like human beings. They come in, nobody knows when, why, or how, and they go out. Nobody knows when, why, or how. Everything is like life, in my opinion, if you look at it in that point of view. I was too sorrowful to discuss the question, which would possibly have been beyond me under any circumstances, and Mr. Omer took me back into the parlour, breathing with some difficulty on the way. He then called down a little breakneck range of steps behind the door. Bring up that tea and bread and butter, which after some time during which I sat looking about me and thinking and listening to the stitching in the room and the tune that was being hammered across the yard, appeared on a tray and turned out to be for me. I have been acquainted with you, said Mr. Omer, after watching me for some minutes, during which I had not made much impression on the breakfast, for the black things destroyed my appetite. I have been acquainted with you a long time, my young friend. Have you, sir? All your life, said Mr. Omer, I may say before it. I knew your father before you. He was 5'9.5", and he lays in 25 foot of ground. Rat-a-tat, rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat, across the yard. He lays in 25 foot of ground, if he lays in a fraction, said Mr. Omer pleasantly. It was either his request or her direction, I forget which. Do you know how my little brother is, sir? I inquired. Mr. Omer shook his head. Rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. He's in his mother's arms, said he. Oh, poor little fellow. Is he dead? Don't mind it more than you can help, said Mr. Omer. Yes, the baby's dead. My wounds broke out afresh at this intelligence. I left the scarcely tasted breakfast and went and rested my head on another table in a corner of the little room, which Minnie hastily cleared, lest I should spot the mourning that was lying there with my tears. She was a pretty good-natured girl, and put my hair away from my eyes with a soft, kind touch. But she was very cheerful at having nearly finished her work and being in good time, and was so different from me. Presently the tune left off, and a good-looking young fellow came across the yard into the room. He had a hammer in his hand, and his mouth was full of little nails, which he was obliged to take out before he could speak. Well, Jerome? said Mr. Homer. "How do you get on?" "All right," said Joram. "Done, sir." Minnie coloured a little, and the other two girls smiled at one another. "What, you were at it by candlelight last night when I was at the club then, were you?" said Mr. Omer, shutting up one eye. "Yes," said Joram. "As you said, we could make a little trip of it and go over together, if it was done. Minnie and me and you." "Oh, I thought you were going to leave me out altogether," said Mr. Omer, laughing till he coughed. "As you was so good as to say that," resumed the young man, "why, I turned to wit a will, you see." "Will you give me your opinion of it?" "I will," said Mr. Omer, rising. "My dear," and he stopped and turned to me, "would you like to see your—" "No, father," Minnie interposed. "I thought it might be agreeable, my dear," said Mr. Omer. "But perhaps you're right." I can't say how I knew it was my dear mother's coffin that they went to look at. I had never heard one making. I had never seen one that I know of. But it came into my mind what the noise was while it was going on. And when the young man entered, I'm sure I knew what he had been doing. The work being now finished, the two girls whose names I had not heard brushed the shreds and threads from their dresses and went into the shop to put that to rights and wait for customers. Minnie stayed behind to fold up what they had made and pack it in 2 baskets. This she did upon her knees, humming a lively little tune the while. Joram, who I had no doubt was her lover, came in and stole a kiss from her while she was busy. He didn't appear to mind me at all, and said her father was gone from the chassé, and he must make haste and get himself ready. Then he went out again, and then she put her thimble and scissors in her pocket and stuck a needle threaded with black thread neatly in the bosom of her gown, and put on her outer clothing smartly at a little glass behind the door in which I saw the reflection of her pleased face. All this I observed sitting at the table in the corner with my head leaning on my hand, and my thoughts running on very different things. The chassé soon came round to the front of the shop, and the baskets being put in first, I was put in next, and those 3 followed. I remember it as a kind of half-chaise cart, half pianoforte van, painted of a sombre colour, and drawn by a black horse with a long tail. There was plenty of room for us all. I do not think I have ever experienced so strange a feeling in my life. I am wiser now, perhaps, as that of being with them, remembering how they had been employed and seen them enjoy the ride. I was not angry with them. I was more afraid of them, as if I were cast away among creatures with whom I had no community of nature. They were very cheerful. The old man sat in front to drive, and the 2 young people sat behind, and whenever he spoke to them, leaned forward, the one on one side of his chubby face, and the other on the other, and made a great deal of him. They would have talked to me too, but I held back, and moped in my corner, scarred by their love-making and hilarity, though it was far from boisterous, and almost wondering that no judgment came upon them for their hardness of heart. So when they stopped to bait the horse and ate and drank and enjoyed themselves, I could touch nothing that they touched, but kept my fast unbroken, So when we reached home, I dropped out of the chaise behind as quickly as possible, that I might not be in their company before those solemn windows, looking blindly on me like closed eyes once bright. And oh, how little need I had had to think what would move me to tears when I came back, seeing the window of my mother's room, and next it that which, in the better time, was mine. I was in Peggoty's arms before I got to the door, and she took me into the house. Her grief burst out when she first saw me, but she controlled it too, and spoke in whispers, and waited softly, as if the dead could be disturbed. She had not been in bed, I found, for a long time. She sat up at night still and watched. As long as her poor dear Pretty was above the ground, she said, she would never desert her. Mr. Murdstone stood no need of me when I went into the parlour. There he was, but sat by the fireside, weeping silently and pondering in his elbow chair. Miss Murdstone, who was busy at her writing desk, which was covered with letters and papers, gave me her cold fingernails and asked me in an iron whisper if I had been measured for my mourning. I said, yes. And your shirts? Said Miss Murdstone. Have you brought them home? Yes, ma'am. I have brought home all my clothes. This was all the consolation that her firmness administered to me. I do not doubt that she had a choice pleasure in exhibiting what she called her self-command, and her firmness, and her strength of mind, and her common sense, and the whole diabolical catalogue of her unamiable qualities on such an occasion. She was particularly proud of her turn for business, and she showed it now in reducing everything to pen and ink and being moved by nothing. All the rest of that day, and from morning to night afterwards, she sat at that desk, scratching composedly with a hard pen, speaking in the same imperturbable whisper to everybody, never relaxing a muscle of her face, or softening a tone of her voice, or appearing with an atom of her dress astray. Join me for the next episode, next video of the story of little David Copperfield. Join me for the next, look forward to seeing you then. It's sad, but join me for the next episode of David Copperfield. See you then. Bye.